They said she would not survive the winter. Not the cold, precisely, though the north wing of Ashvale Manor had no functioning hearths and the wind came through the walls as though the stone itself had given up. What they meant was something crueler. They meant she would not survive him. The Duke of Ashvale, Lord Edmund Cavendish, had married Miss Alara Voss on a Tuesday in November with the expression of a man fulfilling a debt he deeply resented. He had spoken the vows clearly, signed the register, and departed for London before the wedding breakfast was cleared from the table. He left behind a wife who had arrived with one small trunk, a slight cough that had worried physicians for 2 years, and a name that polite society had already decided meant nothing. The daughter of a disgraced solicitor. No fortune, no connections, no beauty that anyone had thought to remark upon. The servants at Ashvale had watched her step down from the hired carriage into the gray Yorkshire morning and felt, collectively, something close to sorrow. She was 23 years old, and everyone who looked at her pitied her. What no one understood, not the servants, not the Duke, not the whispering women of London who had attended that cold, brief ceremony, was that Alara Voss had spent her entire life being underestimated. And she had learned, with extraordinary patience, exactly what to do with that. This is the story of what she built while he was gone, and why, when he finally came back, he could not bear to lose it. The marriage had been arranged in 3 days. That was the detail Alara returned to, in the months that followed, whenever she needed to remember exactly where she stood. Not 3 weeks, not 3 months, 3 days, the length of time it had taken Edmund Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Ashvale, to decide that she was acceptable. Her father's solicitor had delivered the proposal on a Wednesday afternoon. By Saturday, her father, pale, trembling, financially destroyed by a speculation gone catastrophically wrong, had signed the agreement with hands that shook. By Sunday, Edmund Cavendish had reviewed and approved it. He never visited. He sent a letter of 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph outlined the financial settlement he would provide to clear her father's debts. The second described what he expected of a wife at Ashvale: discretion, efficiency, and the production of an heir when her health permitted. He did not ask her age. He did not ask after her character. He made no inquiry about her preferences, her education, or the cough that had kept her confined for most of the previous winter. He asked only whether she was capable of managing a household and whether she understood that his life was conducted primarily in London. She had written back in her careful, steady hand. She could manage a household. She understood his terms. She asked for nothing. He had not replied. The ceremony took place in the parish church nearest to the Voss family's rented rooms in Bath. It was a small, forgettable affair. Edmund arrived with a solicitor and a single groomsman, a cousin, by his expression equally unenthusiastic. He was tall, dark-haired, and possessed of the particular kind of handsomeness that arrives packaged with absolute indifference. He looked at Alara once during the ceremony. Once. Then he looked at the vicar and spoke his vows with the efficient calm of a man signing a trade agreement. Alara had worn her mother's altered gown, ivory gone slightly to cream, and had carried 3 small sprigs of winter jasmine because they were what could be found. She did not cry. Her father cried, quietly, behind her, not from tenderness, she understood, but from relief that his debts would be absorbed and his name kept from the bankruptcy courts. After the register was signed, Edmund turned to her with the deliberate courtesy of a man performing his final obligation. He said, "My carriage will take you to Ashvale. The housekeeper, Mrs. Briggs, will see you settled. I will write when my schedule permits." Then he put on his gloves and walked out of the church. His carriage arrived for her at noon. He was already gone. Alara sat inside the coach as it rolled northward through the gray November landscape and pressed her hands flat against her knees to stop them from trembling. She was not trembling from fear. She was trembling from the effort of not letting herself feel, just yet, how thoroughly alone she was. There would be time for feeling later. First, she needed to see the house. First, she needed to understand what she had been given. That was how she had survived everything else. Look at what is real. Begin from there. Ashvale Manor was not a ruin. That was the first thing she told herself, arriving in the last gray light of a November afternoon. It was neglected, profoundly, systematically neglected, but its bones were sound. She could see that much as the carriage turned through the gate, and she looked up at the long facade of pale stone, its windows dark. its gardens overgrown into a tangle of dead wood and frost-blackened grass. Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper, met her at the door with the expression of a woman bracing for disappointment. She was stout, efficient, and wore her skepticism openly. She had, Alara would learn, served the Cavendish family for 22 years and had no patience for duchesses who fainted at inconvenience. "Your Grace," she said, the titles sitting awkwardly between them. "The East Wing is prepared. The North Wing is not in use. The kitchens are functional. The house runs with a reduced staff." Reduced, Alara would discover, was a considerable understatement. There were 7 servants where a house of this size required 30. The roof above the library was leaking into a collection of buckets that had been there long enough to grow a thin rime of rust along their interiors. The hearthstones in the drawing room were cracked. The kitchen garden had been left entirely to seed. The estate accounts, which Mrs. Briggs presented with the air of someone confessing to a crime, showed a pattern of profound mismanagement stretching back 3 years, not from dishonesty, but from simple neglect. No one had been overseeing them. No one had been asked to. Alara spent her first evening at Ashvale sitting at the writing desk in the east bedroom with a single candle, reading every page of those accounts. She had the cough, a mild fever she had developed during the journey, and a back that ached from the long road. She drank the tea Mrs. Briggs sent up without being asked, ate the bread and cold chicken on the tray beside it, and kept reading. She was not naive enough to think that industriousness would redeem her marriage. She understood exactly what she was. A practical solution to a financial problem. But she had her name, now, the name of a duchess, and she had the house. If no one else was going to care for it, she would. The next morning, she rose before the household and walked every room. She found a child in the north wing. He was 9 years old, thin, and hiding behind a rotted wardrobe with his knees drawn to his chest. His name, when she finally coaxed it from him, was Thomas. He was the youngest son of the head groom, recently widowed, who had been leaving the boy to manage himself during long days in the stables. Thomas had found an unlocked window in the north wing and had been spending his days inside, among the dust sheets and cold rooms, building elaborate structures out of old books and broken chair legs. Alara sat on the floor beside him for 20 minutes before he agreed to speak to her. She did not send him away. She asked Mrs. Briggs to set a place for him at the servants' table. She spoke with the groom, who was a broken man doing his best, and arranged for Thomas to spend his afternoons in the kitchen, where warmth and company were at least available. She had no authority to do anything more than that, but she did what she could. It was the first thing anyone at Ashvale had seen her do. They watched. They said nothing, but they watched. Winter passed with the slow dignity of something that intends to outlast you. Alara did not let it. She negotiated with local suppliers who had been overcharging the estate for years, simply because no one had questioned their invoices. She wrote to Edmund's London solicitor requesting a formal accounting of the estate's outstanding obligations and received, after 3 weeks, a stiffly worded response confirming that she had the authority to review them, but expressing polite astonishment that she had asked. She hired 2 additional servants from the village, a young woman named Dora, quick and cheerful, and an older man named Gideon, who turned out to have been a carpenter before circumstances changed his fortunes. She put Gideon to work on the hearthstones first, then the library roof, then the kitchen garden, mapped out in her own hand on a sheet of paper that she pinned to the kitchen wall like a general's campaign orders. The cough worried Mrs. Briggs more than Alara permitted it to worry herself. She drank the tinctures the local physician recommended. She wore an additional layer in cold rooms. She slept when the fever came and rose when it passed. She did not write to Edmund about the cough. She did not write to Edmund about anything, because she had received no letter from him and understood that correspondence was not expected to flow in her direction. By February, the kitchen garden was planned and the first cold weather crops were in the ground. By March, the library had a sound roof, and Alara had identified 7 rare volumes in the collection that had been water-damaged and begun the patient work of drying and pressing the pages flat. By April, the house had a fire burning in every functional hearth before 6 in the morning, and the smell of bread from the kitchen had reached even the upper landing. The servants had stopped watching with skepticism. They had begun watching with something else, something quieter and more valuable than admiration. They had begun to act as though the house were a real house again, as though living in it were not merely endurance. Thomas spent his afternoons in the kitchen and had begun, tentatively, to bring small bundles of wildflowers from the hedgerows at the edge of the property for the table. Alara pressed one between the pages of her journal without commenting on it. She understood dignity, even in small gestures from small people. She wrote letters to the neighboring families, introducing herself carefully, offering nothing extravagant, simply acknowledging the reality of her position and expressing interest in the local community. Most did not respond. Two did. One of those two was a widow named Mrs. Allenwood, who arrived in a smart gig one afternoon in April with a jar of preserved plums and an expression of frank curiosity, and who left 3 hours later appearing substantially less curious and substantially more impressed. "You are nothing like what I expected," Mrs. Allenwood said at the door. "I rarely am," Alara replied, and meant it pleasantly. Word moved through the county, as word does. The Duchess of Ashvale, that poor girl, the one the Duke had abandoned there like old furniture, was not, apparently, what anyone had thought. He arrived on a Thursday in June without warning. The carriage appeared at the end of the drive at 2:30 in the afternoon, and Alara was in the kitchen garden with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and soil on her hands, directing Gideon on the placement of a new support structure for the climbing beans, when Dora came flying around the corner of the house with her cap half off and her eyes very large. "Your Grace," Dora said, breathing hard. "It's the Duke." Alara looked at her soil-dark hands for one long moment. Then she pulled down her sleeves, smoothed her apron, and walked to the front of the house. He was standing in the entrance hall when she arrived. He had not sat down. He was holding his gloves in one hand and looking around him with an expression she could not read, something between surprise and recalibration. And when he heard her step on the stone floor, he turned. The house was different. She knew it was different. The entrance hall alone bore almost no resemblance to the dust-sheeted, echoing space she had walked into in November. There were flowers on the sideboard, fresh from the garden. The floors had been polished. The portraits along the staircase had been cleaned of their decades of yellowing varnish, and the painted faces looked back with something approaching vitality. There was a faint smell of beeswax and wood smoke and the distant warmth of bread. He looked at her. 8 months had not changed her face, exactly, but something in the way she carried herself had shifted beyond recognition. She stood in the center of the room without apology, her chin level, her gaze direct. She was not beautiful in the way society cataloged beauty, but there was something in her steadiness that made the room feel anchored around her. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was calm. "We were not informed of your visit." "No," he said. "I chose not to inform anyone." A silence followed. Mrs. Briggs appeared at the far end of the hall and stopped, reading the moment with 22 years of practiced instinct. "Shall I arrange tea?" Alara said. "Please," he said. She turned and nodded to Mrs. Briggs, and then walked ahead of him toward the drawing room, and he followed her through his own house like a guest uncertain of the arrangement. The drawing room, too, was different. The cracked hearthstones had been replaced. The furniture had been reupholstered, modestly, with fabric she had found in the attic stores, but with taste and care. There were books on the table that had been read recently. There was a small writing case near the window with correspondence laid out in neat order. He sat across from her and said nothing while the tea was brought. He had the quality of a man conducting a private interior audit. Finally, he said, "You have been busy." "There was a great deal to be done," she replied. She poured his tea in her own and set the cup before him with the same quiet economy she brought to everything. "The accounts," he said. "I received a summary from my solicitor in March. He mentioned you had undertaken a review. Several suppliers were overcharging considerably. I renegotiated the contracts. The annual saving is not insignificant. I can provide you the figures if you wish." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Yes," he said slowly. "I think I would like to see those figures." It was not an apology. It was not even warmth, but it was acknowledgement. She accepted it with the same expression she had worn when he had spoken his wedding vows and walked out of the church, composed, present, entirely undeceived about what was real and what was not. He had come to Ashvale intending to stay a fortnight. He told himself it was the accounts. The estate needed a personal assessment. That was all. He had not expected the house to be what it was. He had not expected her to be what she was. Edmund Cavendish was 34 years old and had been, for a significant portion of those years, a man who managed the world at a careful distance. He had been raised in this house, raised by a father who treated emotional expression as a form of weakness and a mother who had retreated from that father's coldness into a refined, permanent sorrow. He had learned the language of duty very young and had not looked for another language since. The marriage to Alara Voss had been his solicitor's suggestion, framed as a practical solution to a practical problem. A respectable name, modest expectations, simple terms. He had agreed without meeting her because meeting her seemed unnecessary. She would live at Ashvale and manage it. He would provide the financial structure. That was the arrangement. He had thought nothing beyond that. Now he sat across the dinner table from his wife in the house she had quietly, methodically, brought back to life, and found himself confronted with the uncomfortable sensation of having been wrong in ways he had not anticipated. She managed the conversation with the same efficiency she appeared to bring to everything, asking after his journey with genuine practical interest, describing the current state of the home farm in terms so specific and economically clear that he caught himself taking mental notes, listening with apparent attention to his somewhat terse remarks about parliamentary business without appearing to find him dull. She was not performing ease. She had it, genuinely. On the third day of his visit, a letter arrived from Sir Aldous Pemberton, who owned the adjacent estate, informing the Duke that in the absence of active management at Ashvale, Pemberton considered the boundary lane between their properties to be his by long-standing usage, and that he intended to formalize that claim. Edmund read the letter at breakfast with a face that darkened considerably. Alara, who had read Mrs. Briggs's version of the same dispute before he had arrived, Pemberton had been encroaching on the lane since January, said, quietly, "There are boundary documents in the library. Your great-grandfather's surveyor mapped the full extent in 1778. I found them when I was reorganizing the shelves. The lane is unambiguously yours." He looked at her. "I had not found occasion to act on the matter myself," she continued, "as I had no authority to challenge a neighboring landowner without your presence." "You were waiting for me," he said. "For someone with appropriate standing to address it, yes." She paused. "That would be you." There was a moment, a very small, very significant moment, in which the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. "Show me the documents," he said. She did. The boundary dispute brought them, unexpectedly, to a shared purpose. Edmund met with Pemberton. The documentation was irrefutable. Pemberton retreated, ungraciously, and the lane remained what it had always been. Edmund returned to the house with something that looked, on a man unaccustomed to wearing it, very much like satisfaction. But it was the evening after, when the house was quiet, that everything between them changed. He had gone to the library, his library, though it had not felt his for years, and found her already there, sitting in the armchair nearest the fire with a book held in both hands and the lamp angled just so over her shoulder. She looked up when he entered and made to close the book and rise. "Please don't," he said. She settled again, carefully. He stood at the shelves for a while, running his fingers along the spines of books that had been cleaned and reordered, and in several cases carefully repaired. Their damaged pages mended with the particular patience of someone who understood that broken things could sometimes be made whole again. "My mother read in this room," he said finally. He was not looking at Alara. He was looking at the shelves. "Every evening, when I was young. After my father, after he had retired." He stopped. Alara did not speak. She turned one page, very quietly, as though to signal that the silence was safe. "He was not a kind man," Edmund said. "My father. He was dutiful, enormously dutiful. But kindness it was not something he had particular use for." He turned from the shelf. "I have been told, on more than one occasion, that the resemblance is notable." "Who told you that?" she asked. Her voice was even. "People who knew him. People who know me." He moved to sit in the chair across from her, the chair that had been empty every previous evening, she noted. "Do you agree with them?" She considered the question with the honesty he was beginning to understand was simply her nature. "I think," she said, carefully, "that duty and coldness are not the same thing, though they can wear each other's coats." He was quiet for a long time. "I did not treat you well," he said. At the beginning. No, she agreed. She did not add anything to soften it. I am not accustomed to, he stopped. Tried again. I have not been here, he said. For a long time, I have not been here. In any sense of the word. She looked at him then. Really looked at him. Looked at the set of his jaw, the careful way he held himself, the small signs of a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long he had forgotten it had a weight. She had seen that particular posture before. She had worn it herself. There is time, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not an invitation. It was simply an observation. True, and precisely waited. He looked at the fire for a long time, and said nothing more. But he did not leave. In August, the storm came. It began in the afternoon as a darkness on the northwestern horizon and arrived by evening as something that felt almost personal in its force. Wind that stripped the kitchen garden bare. Rain that overwhelmed the gutters, a sound from the far end of the east wing that turned out to be the copper flashing on the upper roof, giving way. By 10 o'clock, water was coming through the ceiling of the room above the library in quantities that threatened the books below. Edmund and Alara moved the books themselves, carrying armloads in the dark with candles that kept being snuffed by the drafts. Working in a silence that was companionable by then rather than careful. Dora appeared with additional candles and a look of grim determination. Gideon came from his cottage near the stables, soaked, and went directly to the roof with timber and rope before anyone asked him to. It was Thomas who caused the real alarm. No one had seen him since supper time. The groom went to the stables and found them empty of the boy. Alara, who had learned Thomas's habits over 8 months better than his own father knew them, went directly to the north wing. She found him at the window he had always used, the unlatched casement on the lower floor, frozen there. Having gone in to retrieve his book structures and found himself unable to get back out against the force of the wind. He was wet, cold, and utterly silent with the particular silence of a child who has decided that crying would be useless. Edmund was 2 steps behind her when she reached the boy. He said nothing, simply lifted Thomas bodily from the windowsill, wrapped his own coat around him with a competence that suggested long-buried instinct rather than habit, and carried him to the kitchen. Alara watched him do it, watched him sit the boy down by the range and crouch to his level and say, in a voice she had not yet heard from him, quieter than his usual voice, and a good deal gentler, "You are perfectly all right. The storm cannot reach you in here." Thomas, who was not a trusting child, looked at the Duke of Ashvale for a long moment. Then he nodded. Later, after the boy had been dried and wrapped and sent to sleep on a cot near the kitchen fire, and after the roof had been as stabilized as was possible in such weather, Edmund stood with Alara in the corridor outside the kitchen with rain still hammering against the windows and looked at her in the candlelight. "You knew exactly where he would be," he said. "I've been paying attention for 8 months, she replied. "Yes," he said quietly. "You have." The storm continued until dawn. They remained in the house together, managing it, making small decisions with the unremarkable synchronicity of people who have been learning, without quite realizing it, to move in the same direction. Then, the following morning, while the damage was still being assessed, and the gardens lay in wreckage and the household moved through the aftermath with the tired efficiency of a community that had survived something together, a letter arrived from London. It was from the Lord Chamberlain's office. Edmund was being called back for an urgent parliamentary matter, a vote on a bill he had been expected to champion, a bill that would take weeks, possibly months, to see through. His presence was considered essential. His departure was requested within 3 days. He read the letter at the breakfast table while Alara watched him and said nothing. When he looked up, his face was composed again in that way she had come to recognize as him preparing to do what was required rather than what was wanted. "I must go to London," he said. "I understand," she said. "Alara," he stopped. She had not heard him say her name before. Not once in 9 months of marriage. The sound of it between them had an almost physical quality, like a door that had been sealed for a long time suddenly opening on its own. She looked at him and waited. "I do not," he set down the letter. "I find that I am not." He stopped again. His jaw worked. He was a man whose vocabulary for certain kinds of feelings had never been properly built, and she watched him searching for the architecture of something honest, and coming up short, and trying again anyway. "I don't want to leave," he said finally. Simply. She was quiet for a moment. "Then come back," she said. It was not a command. It was not a plea. It was an invitation, extended with the dignity of a woman who had built something worth returning to and knew it, and who would not beg anyone to recognize the value of what she had made. He left the next morning. He did not look back from the carriage, but she saw his hand against the window glass, just for a moment, as the vehicle turned through the gate. A small gesture, private, almost involuntary. She turned back to the house and went inside. September came, and then October. The kitchen garden was replanted after the storm's damage. Gideon repaired the roof properly, and Thomas helped him carry tiles and grew, and probably 6 inches taller in what seemed a matter of weeks. Mrs. Allenwood visited twice. The neighboring families who had not responded to Alara's letters in the spring began to call. Letters came from Edmund. That was different. That was entirely, significantly different. They were not long. He was not, she had accepted, a man who would ever write long letters. But they were regular, and they were real, and they asked after the house in ways that suggested he was imagining it rather than merely inquiring. He asked about Thomas. He asked about the East Garden and whether the climbing beans had survived the storm. He mentioned, in passing, that London was a great deal of noise and very little warmth, and that he found himself increasingly aware of the contrast. She wrote back. She told him the truth. The beans had not survived, but she had already planted winter kale in their place, and Thomas had discovered a talent for whitewashing that Gideon was encouraging. And the library smelled magnificent in autumn, like old paper and would smoke. And she had found a second collection of surveyor's maps behind the ones she had discovered before and thought he might want to look at them when he returned. When he returned, she wrote that as though it were certain. He arrived on a Wednesday in late October with the first smell of real cold in the air, and this time he sent a letter ahead. 3 days' notice. Enough time. She did not make any elaborate preparation. She was in the entrance hall when his carriage came through the gate, not because she had been waiting anxiously, but because she was crossing from the library to the east sitting room, and she happened to see it through the window. She went to the door and opened it herself before he could knock. He stood on the step with the October wind lifting the brim of his hat. He looked at her for a moment, and something in him was different. Something in the set of his shoulders, the careful guard around his eyes. It was lower. Whatever he had built around himself over 34 years had, somewhere between London and Ashvale, shifted. "You are well," he said. "I am," she said, coming out of the cold. He came in. He stood in the entrance hall and looked around him the way he had looked the first time. But now the expression was not recalibration. It was something closer to recognition. Like a man who has been away from a place he didn't know was home until he stood inside it again. He turned to her. "I have been thinking," he said, since before June, if I am honest, about what you said. In the library, that there was time." He pulled off his gloves slowly. "I have been considering whether I have the right to ask for it." "Whether you have the right," she repeated. "I was not a husband to you," he said. He said it without decoration, in the plain factual tone of a man who has rehearsed an honest accounting. "I made an arrangement and abdicated everything beyond its minimum terms. I left you in a house that was half a ruin with no instruction and no support, and no." He stopped. "I told myself it was what we had agreed upon, that you had understood the nature of it." "I did understand it," she said. "Yes," he said, "but understanding a thing does not make it right. And I did not. I was not capable, then, of seeing clearly what I had done, what I had failed to do." He looked at her with the directness of someone who has practiced this and is no longer sure practice is enough. "You built something here. You built it alone. You have made a home out of a house I abandoned, and you have managed it and protected it." And he stopped. "Thomas told me, in his letter, he writes to me now, did you know? He told me he was writing," she said. "I helped him spell Cavendish." For a moment, something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, but lived somewhere between the two. "He told me," Edmund said, "that you sat on the floor beside him when you found him in the north wing. That you sat on the floor and waited until he was ready to speak." She said nothing. "I do not know how to do that," he said quietly. "I did not know it was a thing that could be done. I was not. No one ever." He stopped. He put his hand flat against the wall beside him as though he needed the anchor of stone. "I am afraid," he said, and the words appeared to cost him a great deal, "that I have not got the faintest idea how to be what you deserve. But I am less afraid of that than I am of the alternative. What is the alternative? She asked. He looked at her steadily. Continuing to live at a distance from the only place that has felt, since June, like somewhere I could actually breathe. The hall was quiet around them. From the kitchen came the distant sounds of Dora and Mrs. Briggs and the smell of something warm on the range. Outside, the October wind moved through the recovered garden, through the kitchen herbs Alara had planted in spring, through the climbing structures and the new-laid beds, and the long rows of everything she had grown from almost nothing. She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had walked out of a church without looking back, who had left her in a cold house with 7 servants and broken hearthstones, who had not asked her name when he agreed to marry her and had not said it aloud for 9 months afterward. She looked at him and saw all of that, clearly, without flinching. She did not look away from what had been. She had never had any talent for looking away, and she also saw what was in front of her. A man who had come back. A man who had, in his stiff and unaccustomed way, been trying, since June, to learn a language he had never been taught. You will make mistakes, she said. Almost certainly, he said. And when you do, she continued, I will tell you directly. I am not suited to suffering in silence and calling it virtue. I know, he said. I am beginning to understand that rather well. And I will expect to be spoken to, she said. As a person, not managed, not administered. Spoken to. Yes, he said. I am attempting to ask, for exactly that opportunity. She studied him for a moment longer. Then she stepped back from the door, a small, deliberate movement, and said, Come and see what Gideon has done to the east sitting room. And then I want to show you the second set of surveyor's maps. He followed her. He would. She had begun to allow herself to believe, continue following her. Not out of obligation or duty or the administrative logic of a practical arrangement, but because he had walked into a house she had remade from cold stone and neglect into something that held light and warmth and the small daily proofs of a life genuinely lived. And he had looked at it, and at her, and understood at last what it had cost to build it, what it was worth, what she was worth. That evening, they sat together in the library. He looked at the maps. She read her book. The fire burned steadily between them, and Thomas's latest small arrangement of autumn leaves sat on the corner of the desk, and outside the wind moved quietly through the garden. And the house held them both without ceremony, as a house that has been properly loved will do. Edmund looked up from the maps at one point and found her looking at him, not with hunger or softness or any of the romanticized expressions he would have been, perhaps, expecting. She looked at him with the calm, clear, evaluating gaze of a woman who had survived an enormous amount and was still, deliberately, choosing to remain. Choosing to give this, whatever this was, its proper chance. He held her gaze. He said, quietly, I could not have imagined you. 8 months ago, I could not have imagined. He stopped. I did not look at you. Not really. Not once. I know, she said. I see you now, he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, simply, yes. You do. It was not the end of everything difficult between them. She was practical enough to know that. There were rooms in him still locked, habits of distance still to be unlearned, occasions still ahead when his instinct would be to retreat to duty rather than remain in feeling. But he had come back. He had said her name. He had sat beside her in the storm and carried a child through the dark and written letters about kale and surveyor's maps and the smell of London in winter, which was nothing, apparently, compared to the smell of Ashvale in autumn. He had come home. And she, Alara Voss, once Miss Alara Nobody. The girl everyone had pitied standing in a dim church in a borrowed gown with 3 sprigs of winter jasmine and a father who was weeping from relief, was the reason he had won. The fire burned. The wind moved quietly in the garden. And in the library that smelled of beeswax and old paper and wood smoke and care, the Duke of Ashvale looked at his wife across the warm room she had made from nothing, and understood, completely, quietly, and far too late, and also exactly in time, that she was the only thing in his life he could not bear to lose. And that, dear listeners, is the story of a girl everyone pitied, and the home she built while no one was looking, and the man who had to lose everything cold and hollow in himself before he could finally see the warmth she had kept burning for him all along. If this story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for Alara from the very first cold November morning, please leave a comment below. and tell us what moment stayed with you. Share this with someone who loves a slow burn romance done right. Like this episode, subscribe to the channel, and come back soon, because the next story is already waiting, and trust us, you will not want to miss it.